President Trump today held a phone call with Chinese President Xi Jinping. They talked about many things: Ukraine, Russia, soybeans, and the like. We turn now to our Willie James Inman at the White House. Here we go, straight ahead. It said turn, and I turn when it says turn, but no, it's straight ahead. Willie James, it's great to see you. I brought up soybeans because, yes, there are international policy issues that the two discuss, but for American agriculture, soybeans is a big deal.
Yeah, that's right, Major. Remember, those farmers that grow soybeans have really been operating at a loss because, in large part, China has turned to other countries in South America, for instance, to purchase those soybeans. But that was a major sticking point in those conversations between President Trump and President Xi that happened in South Korea. Now, the president described this call as a good phone call, and the press secretary said that it lasted for about an hour. And as you mentioned, there were trade discussions in this phone call, but also Russia and Ukraine came up as well. So perhaps the president giving President Xi an update in terms of those conversations that are happening between Russia, Ukraine, and the United States, playing the mediator there. But the president also mentioning that President Xi invited him to Beijing next year in April, and that he accepted that invitation. And also, Major, the president said later in the year that he will host President Xi for a state visit here at the White House. So certainly that could perhaps improve the relationship between China and the United States amid all of this trade situation. Certainly that has been up in the air. But the president seemingly working to improve that relationship, at least day by day, and including with this phone call that we heard about earlier today.
And it's worth reminding our viewers, Willie James, that when the war between Russia and Ukraine, which Russia launched, was not very old, Russia and China said they were very closely aligned in all sorts of security and policy respects. The president, perhaps using this phone call to read in the Chinese leader about where negotiations stand, Russia and Ukraine, brings them tighter into that circle. And has the White House said anything more today about what it believes the status of those talks with Ukraine are, and the Europeans as well?
Yeah, you make an excellent point. And amid these ongoing conversations that also include the Europeans, we saw over the weekend Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who's also the national security advisor, saying that these conversations were productive, that the president was happy about the conversations. He read the president into those details that happened over the weekend. You see a picture there of those American officials, including Steve Witkoff, there at the table with the Ukrainians. There are certainly some key factors that need to be hammered out because this deal, as it stood, some lawmakers were concerned that it heavily favored the Russians. The U.S. says that they authored this deal, presented both sides with the deal, and worked with both sides to come up with it. But still, nonetheless, Zelensky likely pushing back against that land swap or land deal. Certainly some details that still need to be worked out, Major.
Willie James Inman, North Lawn of the White House. Thanks so much. I want to bring in the co-founder of American Dynamism, Katherine Boyle. Her organization invests in companies that support the national interest of the United States. She is also well known for her ties to Vice President J.D. Vance. It's great to have you with us. What is your perspective on where things stand with these conversations? As Willie James Inman just pointed out, Secretary of State Rubio has had a lot of explaining to do about the origins of this 28-point peace plan. Was it heavily influenced by the Russians? Is it an ultimatum? Is there a deadline of Thursday of Thanksgiving for the Ukrainians? There's a lot still hanging in the air, seemingly in limbo.
Yes, well, I think the tone coming out of today was much more optimistic than over the weekend. But I also think it's emblematic of how this administration likes to get things done. It is often messy. It is often moving extremely fast. And there's often a lot of changes that come in by the hour. And so, if we look back to the peace process for Israel and Gaza, there were a lot of surprises in those conversations as well. Similarly, those conversations were led by what the Financial Times called deal guys, not diplomats, and came to a solid conclusion. And so I think you're seeing in some ways the same playbook play out, which is here are 28 points. Here are ideas that are around the table. How do we get everyone to the table and negotiate? That is how this administration likes to do business and really likes to conduct foreign affairs.
And why do you believe the Army Secretary in the latter stages of this became such an important conversationalist and communicator with the Ukrainians? Because heretofore, Army Secretary Driscoll wasn't visible, now very visible. Why do you think that is?
I think it is a very important thing to call out that he is in these conversations. For the last 10 months, he has been very focused on production, on modernizing the US Army, and really focused on making sure that the defense industrial base beefs up its munitions development. This is something that has been, talked about for the last few years, that Russia and China have really been building their defense industrial bases during this war, and the US has been lagging. And that there isn't an infinite stockpile of missiles and munitions that we can supply the Ukrainians. And so I think him being at that table is a huge signifier that production and that the munitions capacity that we have as a country is being strained by a war that is entering its fourth year. That is definitely been a strain on the defense industrial base. And it's also a note that this is an administration that is starting to look more to other theaters, particularly the Indo-Pacific, much more focused on China than the previous administration. And so I think in some ways, this is sort of a very, I would say, a fast moving conversation for a reason. And that is because there are other priorities that the administration is focusing on.
To that point, Catherine, how do you evaluate, and I don't think it was a coincidence, President Trump talking to President Xi today of China in this context?
I think he realizes that he is a very important player, not only in this negotiation, but in future negotiations. And it is a nod to the fact that we have to hurry things up. The vice president said that in a tweet today, noting that the priorities of most Americans are things like the cost of housing. There's domestic issues that Americans want to be focused on, and that China is really becoming, I think, in many ways, the focal point of the administration going forward. So it's no surprise that conversation happened today, that Ukraine came up, and that the president is trying to build that bridge for future negotiations.
Catherine, it's already been established by this administration that the Europeans have to fund purchases of munitions and missiles for the Ukrainians, not the United States provide them without any payment in return. That's a big shift. Isn't that an important signifier that the Europeans are now putting their money on the table and they're going to have a voice in this as well?
Absolutely. I think it is very important that Europe steps up and starts funding its defense, and has done so. I think it's been a very important part of how this war has played out. But at the same time, they're at a lag. There has not been decades of investment in Europe in their industrial capacity, and so they are at a great disadvantage when it comes to competing head to head with other nation states. I'd say the same thing with the U.S. There is not an infinite amount of munitions. We do not have enough factories. We do not have enough ways to build up a depleted munitions capability. And so that's something that the Secretary of the Army has talked about the need to invest in the American industrial base, to focus on conflicts of the future, to focus on weapon systems of the future, and not be looking towards the past. And so I think him being in these conversations is part of that appeal. But it's also something that is really kind of top of mind, I would say, for this administration, is moving forward from this conflict.
Katherine Boyle, it's been a pleasure. Thanks so much for your time.
Thanks so much for having me.